Most people don't know this single Arctic decision just made the American century impossible to extend, friends. Thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the most consequential territorial decision of the 21st century was not made in a war room, not announced at a summit, and not covered by a single major American network? What if I told you that while Washington was consumed by its own political theater, a quiet decision made in the frozen silence of the Arctic has already determined which civilization leads the next 100 years, and that the answer is not the one most people expect? For over a century, the architecture of global power has rested on a single assumption: that the nation controlling the world's critical trade routes, critical resources, and critical technologies would remain the nation that sets the terms for everyone else. That assumption built the American century. It funded the American military. It justified American foreign policy in every corner of the world. And it has now been quietly, structurally, and permanently undermined by a decision most Americans have never heard of. Before we examine what has actually happened, if you are finding this analysis of shifting global power valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue producing the kind of deep geopolitical coverage that mainstream media consistently fails to deliver. To understand what has changed, we must first understand what the Arctic actually represents. For most of recorded history, the Arctic was frozen, inaccessible, and economically marginal. No trade routes ran through it, no armies moved across it. The great powers of the 19th and 20th centuries ignored it entirely because ignoring it cost them nothing. That calculation has changed with a speed that has outpaced the strategic thinking of every major power except one. The Arctic is opening. The ice that made it impassable for most of human history is retreating at a rate that has exceeded virtually every scientific projection. What was frozen is becoming navigable. What was inaccessible is becoming strategic. What was irrelevant is becoming the most contested geography on Earth. And in this transformation, one country holds an advantage so overwhelming that no combination of rivals can overcome it within any politically relevant time frame. That country is Canada, and the decision that has made the American century impossible to extend was made not with weapons, not with threats, and not with dramatic confrontation. It was made with infrastructure, with legal frameworks, and with the patient geographic reality that no amount of American economic pressure can alter. The Northwest Passage runs through Canadian territorial waters. This single geographic fact, unremarkable for most of human history because the passage was frozen solid, has become the foundation of a strategic transformation whose implications dwarf anything currently dominating political discourse. A shipping route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through Canadian Arctic waters, cutting thousands of kilometers off journeys between Europe and Asia, is becoming commercially viable for the first time in recorded history. And every ship that uses it must do so on Canadian terms. A vessel traveling from Hamburg to Tokyo through the Northwest Passage saves approximately 7,000 kilometers compared to the traditional route through the Panama Canal. That distance translates into roughly 14 days of transit time and fuel costs that, across the scale of global shipping, represent hundreds of millions of dollars annually. In an industry where competitive advantage is measured in fractions of a percentage point, this is not marginal. This is transformational. The significance extends far beyond shipping economics. The Arctic seabed beneath Canadian territorial waters contains resource concentrations that have barely begun to be assessed. Early geological surveys suggest hydrocarbon deposits that dwarf conventional estimates. Mineral concentrations, including rare earth elements essential for advanced technology production, appear in formations stretching across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. The freshwater resources of the Canadian North represent the largest accessible reserve of clean water on a planet where water scarcity is becoming a primary driver of geopolitical tension. What makes all of this strategically decisive is not merely the existence of these resources. It is the combination of resource abundance, geographic control, political stability, and legal framework that Canada brings to the Arctic equation. Other nations have Arctic territory. Russia, Norway, Denmark through Greenland, and the United States through Alaska all have claims in the region. But none combines the geographic position, institutional stability, democratic governance, and existing infrastructure connections that make Canadian Arctic assets immediately exploitable rather than theoretically valuable. The decision that sealed this advantage emerged from a series of policy choices, infrastructure investments, and legal frameworks implemented over several years that collectively transformed Canada's theoretical Arctic sovereignty into operational reality. The establishment of year-round monitoring systems, investment in Arctic port infrastructure, legal codification of Canadian jurisdiction over Northwest Passage transit, and development of icebreaker capacity, sufficient to assert physical presence across claimed territories. These decisions, taken together, converted geographic advantage into strategic control. American strategists understood the theoretical importance of Arctic access for decades. The United States has consistently refused to recognize Canadian jurisdiction over the Northwest Passage as internal waters. preferring to classify it as an international strait. This legal dispute, maintained since the 1980s, was premised on the assumption that the Arctic would remain strategically peripheral and that the dispute could be managed indefinitely without resolution. That assumption has expired. The passage is opening. The trade routes are becoming viable, the resources are becoming accessible, and the legal framework Canada has quietly built, reinforced by physical infrastructure and international partnerships, now faces Washington with a choice it has spent decades avoiding. Either accept Canadian jurisdiction and negotiate access on Canadian terms, or contest it in ways that will damage relationships the United States cannot afford to lose. The timing could not be more unfavorable for Washington. The deterioration of American relationships with traditional allies, the domestic political dysfunction that has made long-term strategic planning nearly impossible, and the simultaneous emergence of competitive pressures from multiple directions have left the United States without the diplomatic capital needed to confront Canadian Arctic claims through coalition building. The allies whose support would be needed to contest Canadian jurisdiction are the same allies whose support the United States has spent recent years undermining. Canada recognized this window and moved through it with a deliberateness that has not received the attention it deserves. The port of Churchill in Manitoba, long dismissed as an eccentric northern outpost, has been transformed into a strategic asset whose importance is only beginning to be recognized. Situated at the terminus of the Hudson Bay Railway, directly connected to the continental grain belt, and positioned to serve as the primary North American gateway for Arctic shipping routes, Churchill represents the kind of geographic advantage that empires historically spent generations trying to manufacture. Canada possesses it naturally and has spent the past several years converting that natural advantage into operational infrastructure. The trade disputes of 2025 accelerated this process in ways that American policymakers appear not to have anticipated. When the United States imposed tariffs on Canadian goods and classified Canadian industrial products as national security threats, the effect was not compliance. The effect was to provide the political justification and domestic Canadian consensus needed to accelerate precisely the diversification strategies that reduce Canadian dependence on American markets. Pressure, intended to produce subordination, produced independence instead. This is the most historically consistent outcome of economic coercion applied to nations with alternative options. Canada had alternative options because Canada had geography. No tariff can move the Northwest Passage. No trade restriction can relocate Canada's mineral deposits. No diplomatic pressure can shift the position of Hudson Bay relative to European shipping destinations. The physical facts that give Canada its emerging strategic position are immune to the tools through which Washington has historically managed its relationships with smaller neighbors. The critical mineral dimension connects the Arctic question to the broader technology competition that will define the coming decades. The geological formations of northern Canada contain concentrations of lithium, rare earth elements, cobalt, and nickel essential for battery systems, advanced electronics, and military technologies. China's control over processing capacity for these materials has been a primary source of strategic anxiety in Washington for years. Canada's emergence as a major producer, combined with investment in domestic processing capacity, creates an alternative supply chain architecture that serves Western interests, but on terms that Canada controls. This positions Canada not merely as a resource supplier, but as a strategic pivot point. Nations seeking to reduce dependence on Chinese mineral processing cannot bypass Canadian supply without accepting Chinese dependence. This binary creates Canadian leverage that operates independently of any specific bilateral relationship. Canada does not need to threaten anyone. The structure of alternatives does the work. The historical pattern this resembles is not difficult to identify. The transfer of maritime dominance from Portugal to the Netherlands in the early 17th century did not occur because the Dutch defeated Portugal militarily. It occurred because the Dutch built more efficient logistic systems and established legal frameworks that made Dutch shipping networks indispensable to economies that had previously relied on Portuguese routes. By the time Portuguese elites recognized what had happened, the dependencies were locked in and the alternatives had been exhausted. The transfer of primacy from Britain to the United States in the early 20th century followed an identical pattern. Britain lost its position through the accumulation of financial dependencies created during 2 world wars, combined with American construction of institutional frameworks that made the dollar indispensable to international commerce before British elites fully accepted that sterling's primacy had ended. When recognition arrived, it arrived as symptom, not cause. The pattern repeats because the psychology of dominant powers is consistent across eras. Dominance creates the assumption of permanent dominance. Permanent dominance creates strategic complacency. Strategic complacency creates the conditions under which challengers build alternatives that are dismissed as marginal until they are not. By the time the alternatives are recognized as structural rather than marginal, the window for effective response has already closed. Washington is currently in the dismissiveness phase of this cycle. The legal dispute over Northwest Passage jurisdiction is treated as a manageable background irritant. The infrastructure investments Canada is making in Arctic logistics are noted without urgency. The trade diversification strategies Canada has pursued are acknowledged without alarm. This is precisely how powers in the dismissiveness phase behave. They are not ignorant of the facts. They simply have not yet made the psychological transition from treating those facts as marginal to treating them as structural. The Arctic decision that made the American century impossible to extend was not a single dramatic moment. It was the cumulative result of Canada choosing, consistently and quietly, to convert geographic advantage into operational control while the power that might have contested that conversion was looking elsewhere. Infrastructure was built. Legal frameworks were established. International partnerships were signed. Physical presence was asserted. And the passage that connects two oceans through Canadian territorial waters became, incrementally and then decisively, subject to Canadian authority in ways that cannot be undone by tariffs, diplomatic pressure, or political theater. The American century rested on control of critical logistics, critical resources, and critical technologies. Control of Arctic shipping routes will determine who controls the logistics of the coming century. Canada holds that card. And Canada holds it not through ambition or aggression, but through the simple fact of geography, combined with a strategic patience to build the frameworks that convert geographic position into operational power. By the time this is widely understood in Washington, the infrastructure will be complete, the trade relationships will be established, the legal frameworks will be entrenched, and the leverage will be structural rather than contingent. Understanding what happened will be historically interesting but strategically irrelevant. History does not wait for recognition. It records outcomes. The outcome of the Arctic decision is already determined at the structural level. What remains is for political systems to recognize what has already occurred. That recognition, when it arrives, will feel like sudden change. It will not be sudden. It will be the moment when what was already true became impossible to ignore. The American century was built on the control of geography that mattered. The Arctic is the geography that will matter most in the century ahead, and the decision about who controls it has already been made. Thank you for joining me today. If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for continued coverage of the structural shifts that are quietly reshaping the global order. Have you noticed changes in Arctic policy, northern infrastructure development, or Canadian strategic positioning in your region? Share your observations in the comments below.